They train us to see everything, every shifted weight, every eye that lingers a half-second too long on a doorway, every hand that moves toward a pocket when it shouldn't. 31 years between the three of us standing in that hall. Corporal Davies on my left, Sergeant. Whitmore somewhere behind the pillar, and not one of us had ever broken formation at a state event. Kind of. Not once. Until the moment King Charles extended his hand. Not to, in my opinion, Camilla, which to her, the silence that followed wasn't the polite, breathless kind you get when a soprano hits a note that shouldn't be humanly possible. It was the other kind, the kind that has weight, the kind that presses against your eardrums like you've descended too fast, and your body hasn't caught up with where I guess, stood guard at funerals, at abdications. At the moment, a former prime minister was removed from a state dinner by men in suits who never gave their names, and I have watched history happen from 12 feet away while keeping my face like poured concrete. That night, for the first time in my career, I almost moved. Not because of the king, because of what I saw on the face of the one guard nobody was watching. Private Ellis, sort of, had been on post for 6 hours. His boots were regulation. His chin was regulation. But his hands, God, his hands, were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold, and everything to do with what he knew. What he knew that none of the rest of us did yet. This is what happened in that hall. The chandeliers at Windsor have a sound, and nobody tells you that in the briefings. They walk you through the threat assessment, the cordon positioning, the radio channels, the faces of the 6 individuals currently under boost watch status. All of it typed in neat paragraphs with the ministry seal at the top. Nobody thinks to mention that the chandeliers hum when the heating vents kick on, a low, to almost ecclesiastical drone that sits just below human conversation and just above silence. After you know, your first hour, on post, you stop hearing it. After your third, it becomes the sound of your own thinking. I'd been on post 4.5 hours when the state dinner moved into its third act. That's what Davies calls it. Basically, the third act. First act is arrivals. Coaches, motorcades. The particular theater of people pretending not to stare at each other, while absolutely staring at each other. Second act is the meal itself, which from our angle is just the back of 100 tailored jackets and an occasionally drifting smell of something with truffle in it that costs more than my monthly. Third act is the post-dinner reception, the part I mean, where protocol softens, champagne multiplies, and people begin saying the things they actually came to say. It's also the part where we earn whatever it's they pay us. I'd my post at the eastern corridor entrance, left pillar, inside face, sightline to the main reception floor, and partial angle on the dais, where the senior royals stood receiving. Standard positioning. I could see roughly 60% of the room. Whitmore had the other 40 from his pillar. Davies was, I think, mobile, floating, which meant Davies was the one I trusted to catch what we couldn't. The room was full. Some 400 people arranged in the careful social geometry of events like this. Proximity to royalty as status, distance as insult. Every cluster a small negotiation. Ambassadors, ministers, which the honestly kind of people whose names appear in 3 different countries' newspapers for 3 different reasons. A smattering of celebrities who'd been brought in to make the whole thing feel slightly less like a board meeting with better centerpieces. And then there were the ones like Private Ellis. I'd clocked him early, couldn't help it. He was at the secondary post near the dais stairs, the position that sounds important until you realize it's the one they give to the newer officers because the sight lines are narrow and the foot traffic is minimal. His uniform was immaculate. Bare skin straight, which chin up, everything correct. But from where I stood, I'd a direct angle on his left hand, resting at the seam of his trousers, And that hand had been doing something quiet and persistent for the better part of an hour. Tapping. Not, in my opinion, rhythmically, and not nervously in the fidgeting sense. Specific. Controlled. Which like he was counting something and losing the count and starting again. I filed it. Kept watching the room. The king had been working the floor with the practiced ease of a man who has attended approximately 10,000 of these events and developed, over decades, an extremely refined ability to make each person he speaks to feel briefly like the most important person alive. It is, I have come to understand, a genuine skill. Not performance, something more like weaponized attention. Camilla moved with him, 3/4 of a step behind and to the left, which is always her position at events like this, close enough to be present, calibrated enough not to interrupt. 14 years of watching them work a room together. I could read their rhythm the way you read traffic on a road you drive every day, which is why I noticed when the rhythm broke. It was subtle, and the king paused at the edge of a cluster of guests, spoke briefly to a minister whose name I'd been briefed on, and won't repeat here. And then his attention shifted, not to his right, toward Camilla, to his left, to where the Princess of Wales was standing with a small group, laughing at something, one hand resting on the stem of a champagne flute she hadn't drunk from. The king began moving toward her, and Camilla stayed where she was. This alone wasn't unusual. They split up regularly. Efficient coverage of the room. I'd seen it 100 times. What was unusual was the pace. He moved with intention, not the drifting social current of a reception. He moved like a man who has made a decision. I watched him reach her, and watched the group around her shift, that instinctive gravitational parting people do when royalty approaches, creating a small clearing in the human geography of the room. And then he extended his hand. I guess not in greeting, not the casual touch on the arm or the double-cheek formality of the evening. He extended TBH, his hand the way you extend it across a table when something is being offered. TBH, or confirmed. The gesture of private conversation made public in the middle of 400 people who had all, in that moment, not independently decided to notice. The silence came down like a dropped curtain. 400 people. Not one of them speaking. I'd moved my eyes off the room without meaning to. That's not something I do, and that's not something I'm supposed to do. The training is muscle memory, not thought. Eyes on the space, not the event, because the event is a distraction and the space is where the threat lives. I basically looked back at Ellis, which his hand had stopped tapping, while his eyes were on the king. That alone was a flag. We're trained to watch the room, not the principal, precisely because everyone else is watching the principal. But Ellis wasn't watching the way the guests were watching, with the collective, held breath curiosity of people watching something they don't have context for. He was watching the way you watch something you've been waiting for. I pressed my earpiece, sort of Davies, static. Then, I see it. Ellis. I see him too. The king said something to the princess. Low. Whatever it was didn't carry. She looked at him for a moment. The kind of look that has a very long sentence inside it. And then she nodded. Whatever had just been transacted between them, it hadn't been spontaneous. Camilla, from across the room, hadn't moved, had not turned. But something in the set of her shoulders changed. I'd a millimeter of adjustment that only made sense if you'd been watching her as long as I'd. She knew. I'd been on post for 4 hours and 51 minutes at that point, and I want to be precise about what I felt, because I've been trained to separate what I observe from what I interpret, and that distinction matters. What I observed, a gesture, plus a silence, a guard with knowing hands. What I felt, and I am not a man given to feeling things in the middle of a shift, was the specific unease of watching a door open that you didn't know was there. The chandeliers hummed. Somewhere behind me, in the service corridor, I heard a door close, not slam. Close. Plus, the careful, deliberate click of someone who very much did not want to be heard. Ellis had heard, in my opinion, it too. I could tell because he finally, after 4 hours and 51 minutes of controlled stillness, White looked away from the king. He looked directly at me. And you know, for just a moment, a single, unguarded fragment of a moment that he pulled back almost before it was there, his expression was not regulation. It was apology. There's a weight to formal uniform that civilians don't understand and veterans stop noticing. The bearskin alone, in my opinion, is just under 1.5 kilograms. The tunic is wool, thick, military wool, the kind that would be sensible in a Scottish winter and is absolutely punishing in a heated reception hall with 400 bodies and no meaningful ventilation. The boots, the gloves, the chin strap that over 6 hours begins to feel like it's part of your jaw rather than just resting against it. After long enough, you stop carrying the uniform. The uniform carries you, holds you upright honestly, in the literal mechanical sense, which I've always thought is either a design feature or an accident that became one. Ellis had been standing in it for 6 hours when he looked at me with that expression I wasn't supposed to see. I gave him nothing back, not cold, nothing. The absence of a reaction is its own message, and the message was, I clocked it. We're going to talk about it later, and later is going to be a conversation you'll not enjoy. He understood. I could see it in the way the apology left his face the same way it had arrived. Cleanly, like a light switching off. He went back to regulation. Went back to watching the room. But the room had changed shape. The silence the king's gesture had broken, as silences at events like this always do, not with discussion. With the careful reintroduction of conversation, people peeling back into their clusters and picking up exactly where they'd left off, while absolutely not doing anything of the kind. The Princess of Wales had moved slightly away, not dramatically, not a social drift. The king had turned to speak to someone beside him, performing continuity with the practiced ease of a man who has managed public optics since before most of the people in the room were born. Camilla hadn't moved from where she stood. This was the detail that sat wrong. Camilla moves. Even at the most formal of events, she circulates, not aggressively, not in the glad-handing style of the politically ambitious, but in the way of someone who genuinely finds conversation useful and understands that a still royal at a reception is a conspicuous royal. I have watched her handle rooms for over a decade. She does not stand in place. But she was standing in place, and she was doing it in the particular way of someone who has made a decision about where there. Davies materialized at my left shoulder. Mobile post means he can do that. Appear without transition, like a quietly furious conjuring trick. He's been doing it for 11 years, and I still find it mildly unsettling. Service corridor door, he said. Volume below the conversation around us. His mouth barely moved. Plus, I heard it. Someone's been in and out 3 times in the last 40 minutes. I looked at him without turning my head. Staff? Timing's wrong. Staff movement at events like this has a rhythm. You learn it the way you learn the chandeliers. It becomes background until it's suddenly foreground. The corridor behind us served the East Wing kitchens. The movement pattern should have been outbound at the start of each course, inbound after. Regular. Clockwork, and 3 in, 3 out, over 40 minutes, off any pattern. Ellis know something about that corridor? I asked. Davies didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. I pulled up what I'd on Ellis from the morning briefing. 7 months in. Plus, in exceptional marks from Pirbright, 2 of his training officers had flagged him, not negatively, the opposite. Flagged him as the kind of recruit who picks things up with a speed that makes you slightly wary, because competence that arrives that fast usually means either exceptional talent or something to prove. I'd seen his face at the pre-event briefing. He'd been quiet in the particular way of someone listening to things they already know. I'd noted it and moved on, because that's the job. You note everything. You move on. You pick it up if it becomes relevant. It had become relevant. What I needed to understand was the shape of it. There are maybe 4 reasons a guard at a secondary post has prior knowledge of something happening in the corridor behind him. None of the, for what it's worth, 4 reasons are comfortable. 2 of them are career-ending. One of them, is the kind that ends other things. I pressed my earpiece. Protocol name for the post commander. Plus, no names on channel. Sort of. 4-7, this is 3-2. Requesting a quiet conversation with secondary dais post when feasible. Not on channel. A pause, which then, copy, 3-2, hold. I held basically, the reception moved around me. Champagne circulated. An ambassador said something that made the cluster near the windows laugh, genuinely, which almost never happens at these events, and meant either he was unexpectedly funny, or someone had had enough to drink that real laughter was possible again. The Princess of Wales was speaking with a woman I recognized from a cultural foundation. Her face was composed. Basically, warm. She had, from the outside, completely normalized. But she was standing at a slight angle that kept the king in her peripheral vision. I know what peripheral vigilance looks like because I practice it constantly. I recognized it the way you recognize a familiar habit in someone else, with the small, uncomfortable jolt of a mirror. The earpiece came back, and secondary post is yours. 2, I guess, minutes. Davies moved to cover my position without me having to tell him. 11 years. I crossed the floor the long way, staying to the wall, keeping out of the principal sight lines, which is second nature. The reception absorbed me the way a large room absorbs a man who does not want to be noticed. I reached Ellis's post from the east side. He heard me coming. Of course he did. "Sir," he said. Plus, still regulation. Chin up. Plus, eyes front. "At ease," I said. Which, at a formal reception, meant only the marginal easing that allows conversation without both of us looking like ventriloquists. I stood beside him. Same sight line. Which same angle. 2 guards at a secondary post. Which is unremarkable. "Tell me about the corridor," I said. A beat. The precise length of a man choosing what to give up and what to hold. "I was approached 3 weeks ago," he said. "By a man who knew my name, my mother's name, and my posting schedule." A pause. He wanted, honestly, to know the service entrance rotation for state events in the East Wing. I kept my face concrete, kept my eyes on the room. "And you said?" I said nothing. "And then?" He said it didn't matter, that he already had what he needed from someone else, that he was just seeing if I'd be cooperative. A breath that was nearly invisible. He wanted me to understand how close they were to something without telling me what it was. Psychological preparation. Sort of. Classic. "You didn't report it." "No, sir." "Why?" The longest pause of the evening. "Because I didn't know who to trust," he said. "And I still don't." The chandelier above us hummed. I thought about Camilla, standing in place, unmoved, in a room where everything else drifted. I thought about the king's hand, extended with intention. I thought about the princess's peripheral vigilance, practiced as any guards. I thought about the door in the service corridor, opening and closing 3 times in 40 minutes, off any pattern. "You're going to tell me everything," I said. "In the order it happened, starting from 3 weeks ago." "Yes, sir." "And then," I said, "you're going to tell me why you looked at me like you owed me an apology when you hadn't done anything wrong yet." He said nothing, which was, I was increasingly certain, the most important thing he'd said all night. Ellis talked, not the way guilty men talk. All rush and justification, filling the silence with their own noise. He talked the way men talk when they've been carrying weight alone long enough that the relief of putting it down is physical, measured, precise, each word placed. I listened the way I've been trained to listen, which is without expression and without interruption and with every part of my attention. That's engaged in watching the room, also watching his hands, his posture, the micro adjustments that tell you whether the account is constructed or recalled. There's a difference, kind of. Most people can't feel it. After long, you know. Enough, it becomes something like a smell. This smelled like recall. 3 weeks prior. Pretty much. To a man outside the car park at his mother's building in Chiswick, because Ellis goes every other Thursday. Because the man who approached him had clearly done the kind of patient, unhurried watching that requires resources or obsession or both. Average height. Unremarkable in the specific way of someone who has worked hard at being unremarkable. He knew Ellis's rank, his rotation, his mother's first name, the time Ellis's shift ended, on the 14th. He did not ask for anything alarming. No, he asked a single logistical question about the East Wing service entrance, framed as hypothetical, dressed up as professional curiosity, as if 2 men who happened to share a background were just talking. Ellis had felt the shape of it immediately. He said no, told for what it's worth, the man he hadn't thing to offer, and the man shrugged the way you shrug when you've already gotten what you came for, which was to see how Ellis would react. Then he said what he'd said. That it didn't matter. That pretty much, someone else had already provided what was needed. That he just wanted to know what kind of man Ellis was. "Which kind did he decide you were?" I asked. He said, Ellis replied, that I was the kind who'd make a problem if I knew too much. And then the man had walked away. And Ellis had stood in a car park in Chiswick for what he later worked out was 11 minutes, not moving, while his mother's kitchen light was visible in the 3rd-floor window, and he made the only calculation that felt survivable. He said nothing, reported nothing, and told himself the visit had been a test he'd passed. He'd known for 3 weeks that this was wrong. He'd known it the way you know a tooth is going before it goes. Not the acute clarity of pain, but the dull, specific awareness that something beneath the surface is in process. "Who else was approached?" I said. "I don't know. Sort of. Guess. Someone with access to the rotation schedule, but someone who knew the East Wing service entrance pattern months in advance." He paused. "Not a guard. Not a guard, which meant someone in events coordination or household management, or one of the half-dozen administrative roles that produce the documents that guards read at briefings. Someone invisible in the way that supporting staff are always invisible at events like this. The people who ensure the champagne arrives and the heating doesn't fail and the program runs to time, are noticed only when something goes wrong. Someone who had been very careful to ensure nothing visibly went wrong." "The corridor," I said. "3rd visit was 7 minutes ago," Ellis said. "The timing puts, for what it's worth, them at a service lift. The service lift from the East Wing basement comes out 20 feet from the secondary entrance to the reception floor." I looked at Davies across the room. He was already on his radio, but I'd a different thought first. A thought that took me out of the immediate tactical geometry and into something harder to quantify. The king's hand, and extended to the princess. Not to Camilla, which I'd been reading it as social rupture, as the thing that stopped, the room, as sort of the surface event of the evening, the image that would be in every paper tomorrow, dissected and contextualized and argued over by people who would have 6 different opinions about what it meant. I'd actually been reading it wrong. It wasn't rupture, it was signal. I thought about what Ellis had just told me. Someone with access, someone invisible, a plan with East Wing geography at its center. And the king, who has been navigating rooms like this for 5 decades, who has had more intelligence briefings than I have had shifts, and who extends his hand at a state reception to the one person in the room who has been standing at a slight angle to keep him in her peripheral vision. Not spontaneous. Not sentimental. The Princess of Wales, whom Ellis had watched without being able to articulate why, who had moved to exactly the position that gave her the narrowest angle on the dais stairs, who had a champagne flute she hadn't drunk from, which is the kind of detail you notice when you're watching for something rather than enjoying an evening. The gesture had been the conclusion of a conversation that hadn't happened in this room. And Camilla, who hadn't moved, who knew, who had arranged herself with the particular stillness of someone who has agreed to hold a position while other things happen around her. Not excluded. Anchoring. I pressed my earpiece. 4-7. East Wing service lift. Now. A burst of controlled activity in the channel that I stopped listening to because there was something else. Something Davies was pretty much doing across the room that wasn't part of any protocol I recognized. He was speaking to a member of the household staff, a woman near the service corridor entrance, small, efficient-looking, the kind of person who exists at the edge of your vision at events like this and never comes into focus. And he was speaking to her with the focused attention he reserves for situations that are past precautionary. She was the one who'd been opening and closing the door, not delivering, and counting. Counting the guards. Counting the gaps, which relaying to someone in the basement who had a window. 40 minutes of windows and gaps, adding up to a calculation that someone had worked out weeks ago and confirmed tonight. Davies had his hand on her elbow. She didn't resist, to which she didn't look surprised. She looked honestly at me across the room. Me, in particular, across 400 people who were still holding champagne and laughing at ambassador jokes and had no idea that anything had shifted. And her expression was not panic or guilt or the animal calculation of someone working out an exit. Her expression was actually the particular blankness of someone who has already decided that what happens next is acceptable. That was the thing that stayed with me. Not the plan, whatever it had been. Not Ellis's 3 weeks of carried silence, which not even the king's hand raised in a hall full of people to the one person who had been watching the stairs. It was her face, the way she looked at me and didn't look away and didn't try to run. Like she was also a message. Plus, she was telling me there was a next step she hadn't told us about. Like what had just been stopped was the part they'd expected us to stop when Davies got her into the service corridor and the radio traffic picked up. Somewhere below us in the East Wing basement, uniformed officers were moving through the specific darkness of service passages that tourists never see and histories never record. The reception continued. In my opinion, the chandeliers hummed. Ellis was still at his post, regulation restored, chin level, face concrete. Because the job doesn't pause for what you've just learned, and both of us knew it. The king, on from across the room, glanced toward the east corridor. It was brief. A single drift, of attention, casual enough to be invisible to anyone not watching for it. His eyes found mine, and he gave me nothing. Not a nod. Not an acknowledgement. Not the slightest muscle movement that could be read as communication between us. He looked away, continued the conversation in front of him. I stood at my pillar and felt the particular cold of a man who has just understood something about the shape of the evening, about whose operation this actually was, and from how far back it had been running, and whether the thing that had just happened in the East Wing basement was an ending or a first act. And I could not ask, could not radio the question, could not do anything except stand at my post, watch the room, and wait. The Princess of Wales raised her champagne flute and finally drank. Small sip, composed. Her eyes moved to the east corridor entrance exactly once. Then she laughed at something the woman beside her said, warm and genuine and perfectly timed. And I thought, she knew too. Well, they all did. Plus, every one of them except me